Welcome to week 19 of the Objectivism book study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we're discussing the second half of chapter 6 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, by Leonard Peikoff. This is pages 198 to 205. Jacob this week has a contribution to his reading of this material, and he put it on Twitter this morning, but he messaged me and said, "This is my reaction to the reading. Conservatives will rightly scoff at the communist notion of pathetically making yourself and your family material dependents of the tribe. But those in the anti-individualist variety will openly advocate for being spiritually dependent upon the tribe for your ideas and values. They proudly assert the virtues of independence, self-sufficiency, and personal responsibility in the material realm, then scorn these same virtues as vices in the spiritual realm of ideas and values. That which they spurn as effeminate in material life is praised in spiritual life. Such a gnostic dichotomy cannot and will not hold. The effeminate collectivism of their spiritual world will either bleed over into the material, yielding, quote, Christian socialists, or they will reject the spiritual altogether as effeminate and impractical. The solution: reject the communism of the soul, which demands that you submit your mind and your morals to the tribe, for the same reason that you reject communism of the body. Your mind and values, like your body and your wealth, are yours to steward and not to be farmed out to others. Learn the virtue of being an independent thinker, just as you've learned the virtue of being an independent producer. Learn that the ability to come to independent conclusions is of much more value than the ability to make an independent living, which is very valuable. Learn that just as material wealth is not a zero sum, neither are ideas or virtues. Just as the independently wealthy man does not earn his wealth at the expense of others, so the man of independent mind and character does not build that state of soul at the expense of others. Cooperation is good in both the spiritual and material realms, but only insofar as it is cooperation with other men who are independently competent. Cooperation with incompetence is not a positive value. Learn to guard your soul from incompetence as you guard your wealth. Jacob, do you want to add any additional context to how you intend that to be applied? Is this the way that we think about our social life, the way we think about our life collectively as a church? Show us the application of these abstractions.
It's got a lot of application in various areas, like you just hinted at, in social life, in the church in general. There are some people who might call themselves traditionalists, who, while they would spurn the collective opinions of what's popular today, they would still want to blindly submit their minds and their values to what has been popular throughout history. There are others who would lean more toward what is not necessarily popular today. That's not the way that they would phrase it, but what is respectable today. They probably wouldn't say it that way, but there are conservatives who they have a sense of discomfort when they consider breaking off from the status quo, breaking off from what is seen as standard and respectable and acceptable discourse today. So there's lots of different ways that you can fall into that second-handed mindset. I think one of the major applications that I came away with from the reading that we're going to go over today is the realization that many of those same conservatives are very pro being independent when it comes to material wealth. They just don't see the connection to ideas and values. And if they did, then they might start to see the value in being independent in your mind and in your character.
This is something that you and I, Jacob, have been talking back and forth about for probably a year or two, because we see this movement toward masculinity. Like, for example, Michael Foster's platform and book, It's Good to Be a Man. And we are wanting to come alongside those people that are saying those things and say, yes, and the and is, it's good to be manly in your approach to intellectual topics as well, not just in how you can, for example, relate to your wife or how you can relate to your workplace, but also in what you affirm as true about political topics and in how you ground those truths about political topics in an intellectual foundation. We need to have a manly intellectual foundation, which means taking responsibility and leadership. There's that. And then I also noticed that within your Twitter thread that I read, you were making reference to this theme of the connection between the intellect and production. And that's something that we saw in our reading last week. So we can tie what you just said to our discussion last week about the necessity to have a mind and body integration. That principle that the ideas are only good when they can be put into practice. And the practice is only going to be morally good or valuable or meaningful if it is grounded in good principles. The means and the ends must be suited to one another. We don't believe in a divide between those two things. And so I think that there's a theme here that you're getting at, which is that conservatives tend to reject the overly intellectual, because right now in the education system, the intellectuals dominate, and the intellectuals are Democrats and radical leftists and Marxists. And so conservatives are going to push back and say all this highfalutin talk about ideology and ideals is not useful. And the alternative that they're going to say is let's get back to common sense. And some of them will even go so far as to say let's get back to blood and soil. And you hear things like that and you think, no, that's not true. Any interaction on that issue of what conservatives are doing there?
I just wanted to mention that another connection to the reading from today, along with the connection to the reading from last week that you mentioned, is the fact that production and intellect or ideas and values require work, require effort. That's one of the emphases in the reading for today's discussion, that the product of the mind is not a passive thing, in the same way that the product of wealth, of a business or a factory or hard currency, is not a passive thing. It's something that must be produced. It can be copied and leached and stolen, but the original is something that takes effort. And I think that's another part that a lot of conservatives miss when it comes to the realm of ideas. They, I think, miss the fact that it takes a lot of effort for which you ought to strive to exert yourself, and for which you ought to have a sense of pride and accomplishment to identify correct ideas, to use your creative capacity to solve problems that others haven't solved before, to untie the knots of false dichotomies and things like that. There's spiritual, intellectual aggression, to go back to the theme of masculinity. There's a certain intellectual and spiritual aggression that's necessary, especially on behalf of men. And this is why men are supposed to be the preachers and the teachers in the church. This is why men are supposed to be the leaders in the church and in society. Not simply because we are physically stronger and more capable of physical aggression, but even more so because we are supposed to be mentally, emotionally, spiritually stronger and capable of aggression in those areas. And that's one thing that many conservatives have lost, because they've lost the value and the glory of using your mind, period.
This is a question from Isaac. He says, what is the connection between reason and spirituality? Anyone want to discuss that point, or I could offer my comments on it? In what Jacob was saying, he was bringing up this spirituality, but also intellectuality and the connection to reason. So these two terms, the spiritual and then the rational or the mental or the cognitive, how are they connected? Within Ayn Rand's system, she thinks that they're identical. I think that within Christianity, that's never been the majority opinion, that spiritual equals cognitive. But this is just an overview of the idea. Within Christianity, there is often a discussion of a human being as being basically a body and a soul, or in a different account, a body and a soul and a spirit. And sometimes people try to distinguish between soul and spirit. And I don't know that there's any specific reason within what the Bible talks about to make those differentiations. There's not a whole worked out theory within the pages of Scripture itself on what these things mean. I mean, spirit, I think in Hebrew, didn't it just mean breath? And so when the Bible speaks of spirit, it's speaking in an extended metaphor. It's saying the specific life of the human man. That's what it's talking about. That's how, God breathed into him. When God breathed into Adam, he didn't just give him air, he also gave him a human identity and life. Well, we don't, as Christians, have necessarily a worked out theory about how those relate, but I notice that when I read Ayn Rand's work about the spiritual or the cognitive, that I agree with her general approach, which is to say that the thing that makes a man other than his animality is his rationality, and that's his consciousness. Any reactions to that? I hope that clears it up a little bit.
I think there is general consensus in the Christian tradition insofar as serious thinkers and philosophers have seen that man is a rational animal and agreed with that, or that he is a spirit body integration and agreed with that, the sort of dualism that isn't dichotomous,
Right.
would identify that the rational capacity of man is part of that spiritual nature, along with they would probably mention other capacities. Whereas we, along with Rand, I think would say that the rational capacity of consciousness, the particular type of consciousness that man has, is the root or the fundamental aspect of our spiritual nature, which grounds other aspects that, other Christians might have thrown in as separate things, like the will, like desires, things like that.
Peikoff even mentions that the will is just a certain aspect on the rational mind. The will and the rationality are the same thing, which I'm not even sure if Christianity affirms that or has any position about it, but I'd be interested in that topic. All right, let's go over to Andrew. You'd had something that you were wanting to add.
Yes, I have basically another application of Jacob's thoughts with probably some commentary by my 2-month-old. If you're in kind of a reformed world online, there's been some controversy between people like Jeffrey Johnson and Owen Strachan, who have been modifying and denying some key components of what you might call established orthodox theology proper. So ideas about who is God, how is the Trinity properly understood. And then there's some people on the other side who are affirming the traditional view. And I stand with the latter, and I think most of us do, to the extent that we think about that. What I consider unfortunate, and I want to preface this because this will be on Facebook, that I respect all of the men on the latter side and how they're defending things like inseparable operations of divine simplicity. But something that I think could would be better if they had a different approach is they tend to say, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And the emphasis is on people smarter than us in the past have already figured this out. So we need to trust them because they were here for so long. Now, I agree that in this case, we need to do that, but it's because I think there are good, sufficient reasons. And this is touched on, I mean, I could paraphrase, halfway through our reading today on this. I can retrace the steps that the Augustines and Aquinas and John Owens and Turretons of the world, they made these applications and they made it really rigorous. And we can look and see, as we understand God and theology proper, we need to affirm certain things, especially in Christology, so we don't mix up who Christ is. But the approach of saying we need to go with the oldest voices because they're older is a sign that there's a disagreement with the ideas here that we need to all, everyone needs to, as Romans says, let each be convinced in his own mind. There is a discounting of the idea that we all need to independently trace those ideas that the more accomplished theologians of the past have made and affirm every step of the way ourselves. And there's kind of a dismissal of that in favor of, let's go with the majority report throughout history as such. And I think that approach is very, very weak.
I agree. That's well said. Yeah, if you were to go with the majority report as such, then wouldn't you have to go with the Roman Catholic Church? Or if Islam were to become the dominant religion in the world, you'd have to go with Islam. So there's got to be a standard for determining which majority you're talking about, which majority is important to you. That's super helpful. I wanted to mention one other thing. Jacob discovered where it was that I was thinking in the reading. It was on 204, so it's actually in the reading for this week. And the quote is, it says reason is will on the bottom of page 204, just for reference. And Jacob also mentioned that Jonathan Edwards said something similar. The will is the mind choosing. And I think that Peikoff and Edwards probably would agree on this. They seem pretty similar. Let's go over to Isaac.
Conservatives, this idea of, I guess, like, I'm approaching this from the question of why. Why is there this dichotomy of conservatives recognize these values in the material realm, but they don't recognize those values in the spiritual realm? That's the reason why I asked the question, what's the connection between reason and spirituality? I think, at least from my own personal experience, I didn't recognize how closely tied these things are until I really started to expose myself to this material and what you guys teach at FTNCI, like, I don't think that the broader church recognizes the connection. The spiritual realm is more mystic in their minds. It doesn't have anything to do with objectivity or the faculty of thinking or reason, or if it does have anything to do with things, it's subject to this mysticism. I don't know for a fact, I can't, say like this is why everybody, why there's this disconnect between conservatives recognizing these values in the material realm and not in the spiritual realm. But just speaking from my own personal experience, I think if that gap was closed, the gap being this lack of knowledge about what spirituality really is, that would help a lot, I think. And my mind, just quickly, like Romans 12 about do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. We're not doing a Bible study right now, but that's a verse that came to mind. Like, the Bible has a lot to say about this kind of thing, and it's not being recognized as such.
There's a passage in Ayn Rand that directly answers the question that you asked there. Let me read this. This is from Conservatives versus Liberals. You can find it in the Ayn Rand lexicon under Conservatives versus Liberals. It's from Censorship, Local, and Express. This is not in the OPAR reading. This is not in any of the novels. This is in one of Ayn Rand's other books. It's called Philosophy Who Needs It, page 186. I'll just read this extended section because it just so directly answers what you're saying. She writes, both conservatives and liberals hold the same premise, the mind-body dichotomy, but choose opposite sides of the lethal fallacy. The conservatives want freedom to act in the material realm. They tend to oppose government control of production. At least they did back when she wrote this in the early 70s, I think. She says that they want to oppose government control of production, of industry, of trade, of business, of physical goods, of material wealth, but they advocate government control of man's spirit, i.e. of man's consciousness. They advocate the state's right to impose censorship, to determine moral values. Keep in mind, this is 50 years ago. Parts of this have carried on into the conservatives we have today. They would advocate the state's right to impose censorship, to impose moral values, to create and enforce a government establishment of morality to rule the intellect. The liberals want freedom to act in the spiritual realm. They oppose censorship. So again, this has changed in the last 50 years, but at that time, the liberals opposed censorship. They oppose government control of ideas, of the arts, the press, of education. Note their concern with, quote, academic freedom. But they advocate government control of material production, of business, of employment, of wages, of profits, of all physical property. They advocate it all the way down to total expropriation. So it's interesting to compare. I mean, she's right. If you've read the thinkers of 50 years ago, the Harvard thinkers, the intellectuals at that time, if you've read the conservatives at that time, that's what they were all saying. Now, Ayn Rand goes on, the conservatives see man as a body freely roaming the earth, building sand piles or factories with an electronic computer inside his skull controlled from Washington. The liberals see man as a soul freewheeling to the farthest reaches of the universe, but wearing chains from nose to toes when he crosses the street to buy a loaf of bread. Yet it is the conservatives, who are predominantly religionists, who proclaim the superiority of the soul over the body, who represent what I call the mystics of spirit. And it is the liberals, who are predominantly materialists, who regard man as an aggregate of meat and who represent what I call the mystics of muscle. This is merely a paradox, not a contradiction. Each camp wants to control the realm it regards as metaphysically important. Each grants freedom only to the activities it despises. So, Isaac, there is your answer. That's the answer to your question about why is it that conservatives are doing this. It's because they do not really care about the material world for the most part. They are more interested in religion. And so you're going to see the people that care a lot about religion tend to do exactly the pattern that Ayn Rand is saying here. Each grants freedom only to the activities it despises. Observe that the conservatives insult and demean the rich or those who succeed in material production, regarding them as morally inferior, and that the liberals treat ideas as a cynical con game. She's really onto something here. So control to both camps means the power to rule by physical force. Neither camp holds freedom as a value. The conservatives want to rule man's consciousness, the liberals his body. Does that clear it up at all?
Yeah, there's a lot there. That's good.
Yeah, look that up in the Ayn Rand lexicon. Conservatives versus liberals. Go ahead, Jacob.
To go just a little deeper on that regarding the cause in Kant's dichotomy between spirit and body, or mind and body, Kant said that there's the noumenal world of reality in itself, and then there's the phenomenal world of our experiences and our physicality, and there's no way to cross between them. And you can go multiple directions with that. If you accept that dichotomy, that there's a disconnect between the spiritual realm of things as they are in themselves and objective values and morality and things like that, versus the physicality, practical, real world, material world. Conservatives have accepted that, and liberals have too. But the way that conservatives take it is the way that Kant sort of originally said to take it, which is you can't have access to the noumenal world, the moral world, the world of objectivity and ideas and morality. You just have to assume it. You just have to presuppose it even. And the reason you have to do that is to have a practical life here on earth. So you deal with what you can in the phenomenal world. In the material world, you're a practicalist or a pragmatist, and you assume the truth of the moral ideals of scripture or Christianity or whatever it is. And that results in, like Cody said, or as he was quoting from Rand, the spiritual realm, it's true, but we can't have any access to it. We can't access to it. Our effort doesn't have any impact on understanding it or implementing it or anything like that. So it just is what it is, and it is imposed upon us. And so there's no effort or anything to be done with it. It just is what it is. The only place or the only thing that requires any sort of effort is the practicality aspect of the material world. And so conservatives, focus on physical, material practicality. And then when it comes to spiritual things, it's dictatorial. It is what it is. There's no questioning it. There's no way that your mind can wrap itself around it. There's no way your mind can analyze it or judge it. It is just dictated to you.
Intrinsicism is the word that Rand would use to describe that.
Yes.
Did you have more?
No, that was it. That explains why conservatives have this mindset of not having any sort of initiative or independence or personal responsibility in the realm of ideas, because they've accepted that Kantian divide, and they've accepted the idea that there is nothing for me to do in the realm of ideas. I'm incompetent in the realm of ideas. And that's just the way it is. So that's the good moral way to think about it. And so the only place for competence to play a role is in the physical material world. And that's how you end up with that type of dichotomy.
And the mind, it just amounts to games, which you
That's right.
often see in presuppositionalists. They're treating matters of truth as if they're just intellectual games, or just a matter of trying to line up our statements with something that was given as the answer already.
Yep.
Isaac.
I think just how you start out in the physical world incompetent to overcome it or tame it, the same is true as you start out incompetent in the realm of ideas. But what we're saying is that just like you can become competent in the material realm, you have the ability, you yourself, the individual, have the ability to become competent in the realm of ideas. And that's a spiritual act, engaging the faculty of your mind, of thinking, of reason. It's a spiritual act, and it honors God. The Holy Spirit is described as the Spirit of truth. And I think that's important to think about, that Christians need to think about. Truth and spirituality are very closely connected.
That touches on the conversation that you and I have been having. I love that proposition that you have the ability to become competent in the world of ideas, or the realm of ideas. That is a message that FT&CI needs to be championing and using as part of just the main message, I think, for us. Well, let me start in the reading, because we haven't actually opened the book yet. So we're going to go to 198. The theme here is that reason is an attribute of the individual. This is the only subheading that we're taking this week because we did extra last week. So reason as an attribute of the individual. The point here being that there are collectives of people, that's true, but collectives are collectives of individual entities, and the entity is the individual. The entity that thinks is the individual. So there's no such thing as a collective mind or brain, Peikoff writes. You have to initiate your thought process individually. This is an empirical matter. This is not something that he's saying should be the case. This is something that we can just observe. And so in this material, because remember, we are before ethics, what we're attempting to do here is establish what are the basic facts that are not specifically ethical propositions like you should, rather just what is. And he points out only entities can act. To be an entity is to be an individual. So groups are a derivative phenomenon. This is just a metaphysical fact that groups are a derivative phenomenon. And so that's going to have application when you get into the idea of individuals working together and cooperating, working on, say, an agreement or a contract. It's the individual thinking that is the primary, and the contract is just the cooperation, the arrangement is just a matter of, it's a secondary. So then there's some material on learning, and what is the relationship between this idea of reason being an attribute of the individual? How does that relate to the fact that we are born into society as children and babies and we need to learn things? So he answers that question. He says that you're not actually having somebody else do the thinking for you when you learn. I say this sometimes when I teach music lessons. I say to the student, I am teaching you music, but technically, if you want to be really accurate about it, you teach yourself everything. You're never going to learn anything unless you teach it to yourself. I'm here to facilitate that process, but you're going to have to do the work of teaching yourself how to do this, teaching yourself what this means. I can't do that for you. That's great because it gives them the ownership. It gives them the sense of ability. At the bottom, we see men can build on what they learn from others, but whenever someone reaches a new conclusion, it's an individual person doing that. It's not his predecessor's breakthrough, Peikoff writes. And so what we receive from other people can be the end result of their thinking, but we still have to trace back, just as Andrew was pointing out, we have to trace back and make sure we understand why did Turretin come to this conclusion. Otherwise, what we're doing is not fully a process of thought, rather it's arbitrary. So the creative faculty belongs to single individual men. Middle of 199, he speaks about agreements and contracts, but they're not primaries. Bottom of 199, he talks about language, because some would say that because we use language and because language is so important to our thought process, that therefore we are socially conditioned. He's going to reject that later on in the chapter, but we're not social products. When we learn language, we actually learn how to use language by learning what concepts mean. So we have to do the work before we're capable of doing it. Now, there is a stage in development where you parrot what adults are saying. You imitate words without fully understanding how they're to be used. And that's one of the things that makes kids so delightful to talk with, because sometimes they can imitate, but only mostly. It's funny, but you get to the point of an adult comprehension, and you've actually done the work that Antisthenes recommends, which is investigation of the meaning of words, which is the beginning of education. So then we go to top of 200. He says that others can make man's cognitive task easier. They can make it more difficult, no doubt. If I went around trying to purposely teach contradictions to my kids or confuse them, I could make things hard for them. I could make things unpleasant. But he points out that kids can tell that adults don't know everything. Kids can tell that adults make errors. Kids can tell when they've received an arbitrary answer, even if they don't know the true answer. So nothing can make a child anti-effort unless you put them on drugs that kill their ability to think. As long as they are physically capable, as long as they are the kind of thing that is a normal human being, nothing can make them anti-effort. He writes, because man is a volitional being, his cognitive faculty is free in relation to others. So go to page 201. Peikoff writes, in every field from philosophy to music to science to invention, there have been a few giants whose ideas were the great turning points, followed by many lesser men who elaborated some details of the giants' discoveries. And then he quotes Rand, the greater, the more primary, the more cardinal the achievement, the fewer men were responsible for it. This is a point that Christians, for the most part, really dislike. And that, in fact, that socialists and that collectivists really dislike. They do not like anyone pointing out that the majority of the great things that we have in the world came from individual minds. It repulses them. And it repulses them because they love collectivism. They've embraced collectivism. There are psychological reasons that you could get into for why they have. I think partly it has to do with an inferiority complex. Nobody wants to face the truth about the fact that there are men who are better than them by orders of magnitude. But if we're going to be reality oriented, we have to accept that that is true. That my highest in the realm of music composition is to just be able to listen to Beethoven and understand how good he was. I'm never going to surpass Beethoven. I would have had to have started earlier and worked harder if I wanted to. That doesn't make me a bad person. It's just the truth. It's actually an accomplishment to even be able to appreciate Beethoven for the genius that he was. And I can feel good about that. We hear routinely about a collective thought process, Peikoff writes. When I read that, I thought to myself, I actually don't hear about that. But if I think back to some of the intellectuals that I've listened to from the 1980s, that was a more common point back in the 80s, which is interesting. It actually strikes me that there has been a slippery slope downgrade intellectually, that now the intellectuals don't even think it's necessary to talk about collective thought processes. Rather, they just talk about the needs of their whatever pressure group. And they talk about how people of whatever pressure group just naturally believe this and that it's incompatible with what others believe. The critical race theory has actually made this reliance on collective consensus, collective thought process, superfluous.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was really glad that he brought up the Taggart Transcontinental Board meeting. And I learned this, Cody, through objectivism through induction. Sometimes you need a piece of art to serve as the concrete that you use to help yourself understand a higher concept. And right there's a good example. When you have all these people saying, all right, what are we going to do? I have an idea. No, I don't have an idea, actually, never mind. Everyone throws out a half-baked idea and hoping that no one thinks that they were the one who put it forward. No one wants to take responsibility. And when you read that, what you realize is you've probably had an experience that was similar to that, but not as extreme. And what Ayn Rand is doing is she's taking the experiences that she had throughout her life and abstracting the artistic essential there to put it on display in her novel. But we can probably all think of times when you put an idea out there and someone's like, oh, we could do that, but we got to balance everything. And, I had an idea, but I don't really want you to think that it's my idea. And I've done that before. I think it is perfectly valid when we're trying to understand the concepts being taught to look to things like, the novels to get examples, because they remind us of our own experiences and they help us see, oh yeah, sometimes it's not, collective thought process, you could have that, but then you look at what that would really look like and you're like, well, wait, okay, I understand now why he's condemning that as not true thought. Or if it is, it's because Dagny spoke up and plowed over the people who said that she couldn't.
When I think about what I understand Ayn Rand's belief system overall and summarize it to a kid, I would summarize the theme as group projects are horrible. And actually, if you think about it, group projects are horrible is the theme of Fountainhead in kid terms. And group projects are horrible is the theme of Atlas Shrugged in kid terms. And it's the theme of Anthem. It's even the theme of We the Living. Group projects are horrible because it takes out the role of the individual taking responsibility for what he thinks is true. It takes out the role of the mind. And growing up, I always had group projects in school, and how horrible it is when nobody is given authority. And so everybody has to just sort of feel out the situation. Am I able to be assertive here? Am I able to make a suggestion? How are other people going to respond to it? And their feelings end up ruling the situation. Their feelings determine whether or not you're going to get an A on the project and whether you're going to be the one that has to do all the work and find some way to make it feel like everybody else contributed. I imagine that Ayn Rand must have had a group project at some point in her education, and that she brought that in because she talks about it, like you said, in the Taggart Transcontinental Board meetings. She also has it in Peter Keating's design committee. Remember in Fountainhead, they designed this project for a World Fair of some kind. And it's all these mediocre architects, but all of them working together create something worse than any of them would have created individually. And they try to do that same process to one of the building projects that Howard Rourke designs, the Cortland, I think is the name of it. So Rand writes, the notion of a collective consciousness is as arbitrary as that of a supernatural consciousness. Well, I don't think that God being conscious is arbitrary, but we get her point here. There is no collective consciousness. Both notions represent the primacy of consciousness. Now, I don't think that the idea of God having a consciousness represents primacy of consciousness. We've discussed that. But sure, the idea of a collective consciousness does tend to imply this idea of the primacy of consciousness. This idea of the primacy of consciousness, of collective consciousness, that we're all social products, that we can't know truth except for by means of the collective, this is something that we addressed in episode 45, and it's talking about Carl Trueman. We titled the episode The Rise and Triumph of Anti-Individualism. It's just a thesis that we hear from Southern Seminary and we hear from Carl Trueman, and so we attacked that one head on. It's an idea from Kant, it's an idea from Hegel, this idea that the collective determines truth. At the top of 202, it views human consciousness as a fragment fed by a social mind from which it is not really but only apparently separated, and she says, see Hegel, Marx, and Dewey. That's in order, historically. And then Peikoff writes, both are a priori deductions that flout the axioms of philosophy and fly in the face of facts. I had a friend message me just the other day saying, hey, can you explain what the problem with Hegel is? And my answer was just essentially this. The issue with Hegel is that he's rejecting sound philosophy on the issue of epistemology, on the issue of what is truth. And that has implications. It gets his epistemology from Kant, but it has implications where Hegel goes further than Kant did. Kant was pro-American Revolution. Kant was not pro-totalitarian dictatorship in his explicit writings on political philosophy. But then Hegel said, well, let's take your epistemology seriously, Mr. Kant. And he traced out the implications, which leads to the idea that there is this good, and the good is the collective. And whatever the collective determines is what is true. And the most important collective in his time was the state. And so he became an absolute statist. He thought that the state is the criteria for what is good. And we should all do whatever it takes to elevate the state. We should all sacrifice for the state. Now imagine if somebody in Germany took that seriously. Well, that would be Karl Marx. And eventually that would also be Adolf Hitler. And so that's my 2-minute answer to what's the danger of Hegel. He's a collectivist, and collectivism has consequences. So then we go into this next section here. Peikoff writes, man is not a cell of some larger whole, supernatural or social. He is not a coral bush or even an ant, in the sense of an anatomically specialized organism that can survive only in a colony. Man can survive alone on a desert island or a self-sustaining farm. Man's ability to survive is enhanced by his living in society, but only if it is a human society, which is governed by the power of reason. The next paragraph here, he says that the point here is not that men should be independent or should be individualistic. The point is that the collectivists from Plato to Dewey are wrong metaphysically. The fragment or cell about which they write does not exist. Only man exists, man the rational being. And a rational being's tool of survival is, not should be, but is an individual process, one that occurs only in a private mind and brain. You can contrast what he's saying here, perhaps with Aristotle, and with the Greeks as well. The Greeks in the age of Aristotle, they were discovering philosophy, but they had not yet applied it consistently. And so Aristotle's political theory is not as independent as we would like it to be. Plato was the first communist. He actually invented communism. So you understand, the Greeks, when they were discovering reason, they had not yet figured out some of the things that Peikoff and Rand are taking for granted about the implications. If we are the rational beings, the implication is that we must survive by our independent thought processes. Peikoff writes, this brings us to a final conclusion about man. If reason is an attribute of the individual, and if the choice to think or not controls all of man's other choices and their products, including the emotions he feels and the actions he takes, then the individual is sovereign. Now here, when he says sovereign, I don't think he is talking about it in a way that contradicts what we as Christians believe when we say that God is sovereign. I don't think that's what he means, and here's why. Look at what he says afterward. His own cognitive faculty determines not only his conclusions, but also his character in life. Now, is that true? Sure. Our thought processes determine our life. In this sense, man is self-created, self-directed, and self-responsible. Now, he says in this sense. So he is not trying to dispute the idea that we as individual people come from our parents. And it would likewise, I think it would be an irresponsible reading to take what he's saying here and say that has implications on whether God exists. No, it doesn't. What he's saying is that something has created the kind of beings that exist now that are self-creating beings. And that is true. I think that the objectivists would be very unhappy with my bringing God into the story. And they would also dispute whether or not I am buying into determinism, especially since I affirm God's sovereignty. they'd have things to say about that. But the point here is take him for what he is saying. He is saying that we do create our own souls in a manner of speaking. Peikoff writes, since he is responsible for what he thinks or evades, he's responsible for all the psychological and existential consequences that follow therefrom. I agree with this. If we use the term soul to mean the essence of a person, which is his mind and its basic values, then in Ayn Rand's crucial formulation, as man is a being of self-made wealth, he is a being of self-made soul. That is correct. Now, you do distinguish between immediate causality and final causality, or final causes. Or maybe the word is proximate causes versus final or more remote or original causes. I'm not sure.
Like ultimate versus proximate.
I'm reading the comments to see if there's anything I missed here. So let me go on in the reading. The above does not imply that a man shapes his emotions directly, as we talked about in previous weeks, but he does choose his emotions ultimately by his choice to think or evade, and he controls the products of his thoughts. So he says that the conclusion is that each man as an individual is the master of his own destiny. Now, that doesn't sound like it's compatible with Reformed Christianity. But we have to ask, as Reformed Christians, are individual people responsible for their choices, morally responsible before God for their choices? And the meaning of being responsible is that, yes, the choices that you make will determine your destiny. Now, that being said, as a Reformed Christian, I believe that I'm not going to be able to convert to faith in Jesus and go to heaven unless I have been regenerated by a work of the Holy Spirit, a work that the Holy Spirit chosen that I didn't. He brought something that was dead to life. He turned a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. In regard to salvation, does this mean that I was a master of my own destiny? No. When I was born again, that was the choice of the Holy Spirit. But this doesn't contradict the overall idea that the choices that we make in life determine who we become. And in fact, it's just that the Holy Spirit has created something by giving it new life, something that is capable of making a meaningful choice. The Holy Spirit regenerated so that I could, and this is the part that I'm responsible for, I could look at the facts, affirm the truth, love my Lord, and that is conversion. That is the meaning of conversion. That is the meaning of saving faith. It doesn't derogate the idea that there is real faith any more than the fact that my parents chose to have a baby and that I'm now that baby would derogate the idea that I'm now a living person. I am a living person. I was born, and likewise for the idea of being born again by the Holy Spirit. I think that there's more that we could say about this issue. The objectivists wouldn't be happy, and perhaps there may be Reformed Christians that say, no, I don't agree with how you're trying to make these two ideas compatible. But I don't see a challenge here, and I'd be open to any discussion on that issue. Anyone want to raise any challenges for the account that I'm giving there?
I would just say a thorough understanding of free will versus the erroneous view of libertarian free will, I think would help both sides here. The potential objectivists who might object and the potential Reformed Christian who might object. I think a lot of Reformed Christians, even though they deny libertarian free will, they don't understand why they deny it. They don't understand the problems with it. And they end up accepting a lot of the premises, which leads to them objecting to the kind of thing that's being discussed here.
Well, Jacob just said what I was about to say, at least the first part. The other part, I think, is that there's a similar mistake that goes on here that like Tim Keller makes when he says that God requires us to be generous, and so it's justice when we're generous. It's a conflation of the horizontal plane with others with the vertical with God. When we are sovereign in our decision making, what that means is that we cannot, at the end of the day before God, say, I know that I sinned, but it was someone else's fault that I sinned. It's easy to conflate that and say, my actions surprised God or messed up his plan or something like that. Just don't conflate the vertical and the horizontal, and remember that those are separate. And I think it eliminates a lot of the apparent contradiction.
That's great. All right, let's move forward we're in the middle of page 203. So Peikoff is saying that man is not a determined being, socially determined by nature or nurture. This is helpful because we often are presented in our society today with this idea that what we are is a result either of our genes or of our experiences. Peikoff writes, man is not a product of conditioned reflexes or id instincts or the tools of production. Thought determines action. He's not a puppet dancing on strings of powerless, jealousy, anger, or any other tragic flaw. Thought determines emotion. He's not a cipher ruled by fate, he says, or any supernatural power. The arbitrary is inadmissible. Now, I think we are ruled, certainly we are ruled by a supernatural power. I believe that as a Christian, but I don't think that we are ruled in such a way that is incompatible with the idea that we have volition and we make meaningful moral choices, as we discussed in previous threads. Bottom of page 203. So Peikoff writes that determinism in any variant is invalid. I think that the terminology on determinism is potentially confusing. Jacob, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't like to use the term because the entire discussion has been framed in such an unhelpful way to basically say it's either determinism or libertarian free will, and where determinism means the absence of any sort of free will. So the idea is libertarian free will is the only kind of genuine free will, and the only alternative is determinism. So it's a very botched framing of the entire discussion. And so when anyone reads or hears the word determinism, they're almost automatically thinking of that framing. And that's what makes it very unhelpful. So I like to just try to avoid the word altogether and work on reframing and unpacking the confusions in the whole debate and terminology.
Thanks for that. Now, I wanted to draw a connection between something that happens in the Fountainhead novel to what is being discussed here. And there's a lot that we could say about the Fountainhead in relation to this material here, because the theme of the Fountainhead is that man is independent, that he lives for the sake of working, using his own mind, and he does it for his own sake. You know, Howard Rourke has a sort of a personal motto, my work, my way. That's what he lives for. And he even, if given the choice between the love of his life, a woman named Dominique, versus his career, he would choose his career, because he doesn't think that there's much point in trying to seek a relationship with her if it would require sacrificing his career, because then there would be nothing left of him to have a relationship with. And he knows that she would not even be in love with him if he died in his heart. And his heart is in his work, and that's good. Now, Howard Rourke goes through this struggle because people try to slow down his career. They don't appreciate his genius. Certain people intentionally sabotage him over the course of the novel. Peikoff writes here, this conclusion does not mean that man is omnipotent or that he is immune to the actions of other men. Now, you can see what he's talking about if you look at the story of Howard Rourke. Rourke decides he's going to keep going. Now, the level of success that Rourke is able to have in the world is partly dependent on other men recognizing the genius of his designs. And it's dependent on circumstances that are outside of his control. So we're not saying that any man can become anything he wants. If I decided right now that I wanted to build a rocket ship and go live on the moon, I would not be capable of doing that. That's not the point that we're saying here. The point here is, as Peikoff writes, the individual chooses his own ends and the methods of attaining them. He must choose either to work toward those ends or not. That is what happens in the story of the Fountainhead. And you see one way that that can play out when somebody chooses, regardless of whether other people want to make the road easy for him, he chooses that he's going to pursue that path over the course of his life. And we see what that commitment does to a man's soul and what it does in reality as well to his career. Let's go to the bottom of this. Let's skip, I already brought up this theme that he mentions of nature versus nurture, genes versus society. Peikoff does some polemic against this framework. Top of page 204, he talks about the problem with the gene school of what makes a human what a human is. He summarizes, innately set emotions imply innate concepts and value judgments, or innate ideas, but we've already seen that that's not a valid theory. The gene school breaks down logically. And then in the next paragraph, he talks about the problem with the social school of what makes a human being what a human being is. He says, what does this theory overlook? The fact that percepts do not invoke emotions, only percepts as interpreted and evaluated can do so. Only percepts as conceptualized, conscientiously or otherwise, by a mind. He says, we are hammered today by this false alternative of nature or nurture as man's determiner. It's either biology or upbringing. And he writes, the first theory suggests that the body by itself creates conceptual content in the individual's consciousness. The second, that the parents or teachers do. He writes, the first turns man into a helpless byproduct of matter. The second, of other people's minds. Both theories deny the metaphysical nature of a rational being, so we can safely reject both theories. Now, this next section, I think he makes a point that raises some eyebrows. He says, the mere advocacy of free will does not answer these deterministic views. If volition is held to be a superhuman faculty injected by God into man's earthly identity, as in the Christian tradition. So he's going into some polemic against the Christian tradition, especially what Kant says about free will. And he describes this voluntarist theory. And I looked up voluntarism a little bit. It's not something that I know a ton about. I noticed that it was in Schopenhauer and that it was in others as well. There's this whole theory sometime between Kant and the 100 years that follow him. I think that it might show up perhaps in Lutheran theology. I'd be interested to look at that. But he has rejected this voluntarism theory, and I think I would reject it as well. And so where I diverge from Peikoff is simply to say that I'm not convinced that voluntarism is an implication of Christianity. Jacob, do you have anything you want to add on voluntarism?
I am not as familiar with voluntarism, or at least what Peikoff is referring to as voluntarism, because there are a couple different schools of thought, including divine voluntarism. But if I understand it correctly, it's the idea that the will chooses what it wants apart from any reasons or rationale, which is sort of ironic because that's what I would say is the implication of libertarian free will. If you take libertarian free will seriously, you almost have to get to a point of voluntarism where it's just the will choosing arbitrarily apart from any rationale or reason for it, because otherwise then you've got a sufficient reason, which is the opposite of libertarian free will. So it's a little ironic that Peikoff is saying that here. However, I think he's right to the extent that any Christians have asserted that as the vision of free will, it is wrong. And there are some Christians who would say that there is divine voluntarism, that God has the ability to choose in a libertarian sense apart from his character and nature and rationale. And I think that's also very stupid and bad.
So I wish that he would have more discussion somewhere in his writing on this topic, but I don't find it. And so I don't have a lot to say about it other than that I don't think that it's necessarily relevant to my project of constructing a sound Christian philosophy. It's more of a polemical point to reject some other philosophies. He does in the next paragraph write this: choice, Ayn Rand holds, is not a mystic factor superimposed on a deterministic creature. I think that's the kind of voluntarism that he's trying to reject, and I would agree with him there. He writes, there is no dichotomy between will and nature or between will and reason. He writes, reason is will, and therefore the power of choice is the power that rules man, both in regard to the body, action, and soul. Man is not only free, he is the product of his freedom, which means of his intellect. This is a really broad claim, but I do affirm it. Jacob, do you affirm that claim?
Yes.
Next section says an autonomous entity, he is to be respected and admired if he earns such respect by his choices. Man qua man is a hero if he makes himself into one. I think that what Peikoff is advocating in this chapter cannot be completely understood unless you've read The Fountainhead and unless you've read Atlas Shrugged, unless you have a heroic vision of what man is. And that's not the point of this chapter, to outline what a heroic vision of what a man is. So you have to understand this is footnotes to Atlas Shrugged. And so go to Atlas Shrugged and go to The Fountainhead and see what the vision that Ayn Rand has of what a heroic man is. Deep breath, I wrote in my notes, because we're now summarizing how far we've come and what is to come next. He writes, man is an organism of a distinctive kind, living in a universe which has a definite nature. That's what we've established. His life depends on a cognitive faculty which functions according to specific rules. This faculty belongs to man the individual. What then should man do? So we summarized everything that we've just said in the last 200 pages, and now the coming week after week after week is going to be on this topic of ethics, value. What does it mean to say that something is good? Now, I have just a couple of extra notes I wanted to draw your attention to. If you're interested in learning more about Rand's theory on independent thought and how Rand understands the idea of reason as an attribute of the individual, go to the Ayn Rand lexicon and look up second-handers and read some summary quotes from the Fountainhead. This is some quotes from when Howard Rourke is talking with Gail Wynand, and he's toward the end of the story, he's figured out how it is that his opponents are functioning. And he talks about this idea of second-handedness. This is not something that Peikoff goes into detail in Opar, because all he would do if he were to go into it is just to summarize what you see in the Fountainhead. Now, in the Fountainhead, we have this discussion between Rourke and Wynand on the second-handers, and then we also have, at the climax of the Fountainhead, Rourke's courtroom speech, where he defends his actions. And you'll recognize the words of that speech. Thousands of years ago, the first man discovered how to make fire. He was probably burned at the stake that he had taught his brothers to light. Through the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads armed with nothing but their vision. Those kinds of things that you've seen from Rand. But read the whole speech. It's not long. It is a condensed summary of this point that we're trying to make here. Reason is an attribute of the individual. And so, as a shortcut to reading through the whole novel, The Fountainhead, read that speech and read the material on second-handers. There's a lot of applications that we could make to the church, which we haven't done a lot right now. But as Isaac had brought up, within the church there is this mystical, collectivistic approach to authority and to where truth comes from. And if you can take in what Rand says about second-handedness and about the necessity of independent thinking, then I think that that will help you not fall into this trend that we see in the churches today, especially within Reformed evangelical mainstream churches. I think that it's necessary to arm ourselves mentally in order to do the kind of things that Jacob was advocating at the beginning of this video, to be manly in your approach to thinking, to be manly in taking responsibility and dominion for what is true. And that requires personal judgment. Just as Isaac had said, you have the ability to become competent in the realm of ideas. And when you make the choice to do that, you become a man. That is where your life comes from. And we're going to get into that as we get into this next material on value. What is the good, and how does man seek the good? What is his code of values? We can look forward to this discussion in coming weeks. You can always find us Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern, for replays and to register to join us or to send in questions. You can find all the material at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. Thank you for joining the discussion this week. God bless.